Two ships drifted closer in calm water. Few understood what one carried. The harbor disappeared in an instant. The morning of December 6, 1917, began like any other day in Halifax. The harbor was calm. The air carried a faint scent of salt, smoke, and cold iron. In the narrow streets of the North End, shopkeepers lifted their shutters, fishermen checked their nets, and children hurried through the chill toward school. To the people of Halifax, the war in Europe was a distant echo carried on the wind. Ships came and went from the harbor every day, vessels loaded with munitions, food, and soldiers bound for France. They had grown used to the sight of gray naval hulls and the rumble of trains filled with supplies. It was dangerous work, but routine had dulled the fear. As the sun rose behind a curtain of thin winter clouds, two ships moved slowly toward each other in the waters of the Narrows, the narrow channel that connected Bedford Basin to the open sea. One was the SS Mont Blanc, a French cargo ship heavy with explosives, picric acid, TNT, benzol, and gun cotton. She had sailed from New York bound for Bordeaux, carrying enough force to level a city. Her captain, Aim le Medec, had strict orders to avoid any sparks, to move carefully, and to warn others to stay clear. The other ship was the SS Imo, a Norwegian relief vessel chartered by the Belgian government. She had come to Halifax to pick up supplies for war-torn Europe, and now she was anxious to leave. Imo's captain, Håkon Fram, was frustrated by delays and eager to make up lost time. The tide was against him, and every hour mattered. The harbor pilot aboard Mont Blanc guided the ship carefully down the channel, staying to the right as regulations required. But Imo, moving upriver, was out of position, sailing on the wrong side, trying to overtake another vessel. From a distance, both crews saw each other, uncertain who should yield first. A whistle blew, then another. But in the confusion of echoing signals, smoke, and current, both ships kept moving. On shore, dock workers paused to watch. They had seen near misses before. The harbor was busy, and tempers often ran high. Few imagined anything worse than a dented hull or broken mast. The two ships closed the distance slowly, their dark shapes gliding toward the same bend in the water. At the last moment, Mont Blanc turned sharply to starboard, trying to avoid collision. Imo reversed engines, but her bow cut across the smaller ship's path. At 8:45 a.m., metal scraped against metal, a sound sharp and final. Sparks flew as Imo's bow tore open Mont Blanc's hull just below the deck, near where barrels of benzol were stored. A small fire flickered on the deck. Within seconds, it spread along the cargo hold, feeding on fumes of fuel and powder. Captain Le Medec shouted to his crew to abandon ship. They knew what was inside their hold, and they knew what would come. The men rowed frantically toward the Dartmouth shore, waving and shouting warnings in French. "Run! The ship is full of explosives!" But the words were lost in the wind, misunderstood by most who heard them. Crowds gathered along the waterfront and on the nearby hill called Richmond. Children pointed to the flames. Dockhands and railway workers watched the fire with curiosity, unaware that the burning vessel carried nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives. The scene looked almost unreal, a ship blazing in the center of the harbor, black smoke rising into the pale winter sky. From his train near the North Street station, an engineer slowed to look. From the windows of homes on Campbell Road, families watched from safety, thinking it was only another harbor accident. Even soldiers stationed nearby stopped their drills to see the fire. No one ran, no one hid. Minutes passed. The flames climbed higher, turning the deck into an inferno. Drums of benzol burst with loud pops, sending fragments into the air like fireworks. The ship drifted slowly toward the pier, carried by the tide and the wind. When her burning hull touched the wooden dock, the fire spread across the harbor front. By 9 a.m., the sound of crackling fire mixed with sirens and shouts. A few people began to sense the danger. A sailor from the naval dockyard shouted for everyone to move away, but curiosity held many in place. They watched, transfixed, as the flames glowed brighter than the morning sun. In those final moments before the blast, the city seemed to pause. Somewhere a church bell rang. A mother called her child in from the window. A telegraph operator at Pier 9 tapped out a message, then stopped, distracted by the strange glare outside. At 9:04 a.m., the Mont Blanc exploded. A light so bright it erased shadow. A roar so deep it silenced thought. But that moment, when the calm city became a ruin, belongs to the next part of the story. For now, the morning still holds its breath, and Halifax still stands. The harbor was alive with sound that morning. Steam whistles echoed from shipyards, cranes creaked, horses clattered on cobblestones as carts carried coal and lumber toward the docks. It was a city in motion, unaware that the line between ordinary and disaster had already been crossed. The two ships drifted closer inside the Narrows, a stretch of water barely half a mile wide. To the east lay Dartmouth, to the west the crowded north end of Halifax, filled with homes, factories, and warehouses. The tide was running out, pulling both vessels toward each other like two unwilling magnets. On the Mont Blanc, Captain Aime Lemedec barked orders in French. The pilot beside him scanned the current and shouted directions to the helmsman. They tried to swing the bow away, to find space where there was none, but the Emo loomed large, her white hull cutting across the channel, her propellers churning the water to foam. For a brief second there was silence. Each crew waited for the other to give way. Then came the screech of steel on steel. The collision was not violent, but it was fatal. The impact tore open the side of Mont Blanc near the forward cargo hold. Benzol, a volatile fuel, spilled across the deck and down into the water. When metal struck stone on the pier below, a spark caught. Fire raced across the surface like lightning over oil. Flames rose against the gray morning sky. A column of black smoke twisted upward, visible across the entire harbor. At first, no one panicked. Fires were common in a port filled with wooden ships and coal dust. But within minutes, the blaze grew hotter, brighter. A series of small explosions rattled the air, barrels bursting in sequence. The fire hissed like a living thing. On the bridge of the Mont Blanc, Lemedec knew there was no saving the ship. He shouted for his men to abandon her. They lowered lifeboats, some already burning at the edges. The crew rowed desperately for the Dartmouth shore, waving their arms and shouting warnings. But most people on the Halifax side saw only foreign sailors gesturing wildly. Few understood the danger. "Mont Blanc is on fire," a telegraph operator reported to the naval yard, but no one yet realized what she carried. The ship's manifest, listing thousands of tons of high explosives, was locked away in customs paperwork. Even the Port Authority had no immediate record at hand. The crowd along the waterfront grew. Workers from the sugar refinery left their posts to watch. Children pressed their faces to windows. Some men grabbed hoses thinking they could help. They did not know that every second brought them closer to death. Meanwhile, on the Emo, Captain Fromm and his crew backed away, fearing the flames might spread to their own decks. They watched the burning vessel drift toward Pier 6, smoke covering the sky. Sailors on nearby ships cut their lines and tried to move out of the harbor. Others stood frozen, staring in disbelief. At 8:55 a.m., the fire reached the bridge of the Mont Blanc. The paint bubbled, the deck glowed orange, benzol fumes hung thick in the air. The sound of crackling wood filled the silence between explosions. Across the city, the fire drew attention from every street. A tram stopped mid-track as passengers turned to look through the window. At a nearby school, teachers and students pressed against the glass, watching the smoke. One teacher told her class to stay inside. Another stepped outside to see for herself and never returned. Firefighters from the Richmond station rushed toward the dock. They rolled out hoses and ladders, preparing to fight what they thought was a simple ship fire. No one warned them what the cargo was. They worked quickly, dragging hoses toward the pier, calling for water pressure. Some turned their backs just as the ship began to drift closer. At the naval dockyard, an officer spotted the burning ship and sensed something was wrong. He ordered his men to clear the area. A few sailors ran door to door, shouting to evacuate, but their voices were drowned by the noise of the harbor, by curiosity, by disbelief. By 9 a.m., the Mont Blanc had drifted within a few hundred feet of Pier 6. The wooden structure crackled as flames licked across it. Nearby warehouses caught fire, filled with paint, oil, and lumber. The blaze began to spread along the waterfront. A boy on a nearby hill later said he could feel the heat from where he stood. A woman hanging laundry turned to watch and whispered that it looked like the end of the world. And still, no one ran. In the final moments before the explosion, witnesses described a strange quiet. Birds took flight all at once. The air seemed to tremble. A light brighter than the sun began to bloom inside the smoke. And then the world broke apart. At 9:04 a.m., the largest man-made explosion in history tore through Halifax Harbour. The shockwave flattened buildings, ripped trees from the ground, and hurled debris miles into the air. A column of smoke rose 2,000 feet high. For a heartbeat, the city vanished in white light. Then came darkness, dust, and silence. At 9:04 a.m., the harbor disappeared in light. For a fraction of a second, the world became white. Then came a roar that shattered glass 50 miles away. Every window in Halifax broke at once. Walls folded like paper, roofs lifted into the air. The city was torn apart by a wave of fire and wind. The SS Mont Blanc no longer existed. In its place rose a column of smoke shaped like a mushroom, twisting into the pale winter sky. 1,000,000 pieces of steel, wood, and human life were thrown outward at 2,000 miles per hour. The ship's massive anchor, half a ton of iron, was hurled more than 2 miles away. The blast stripped trees bare, overturned trains, and vaporized buildings. For many, the explosion was sound before sight. People in Truro, more than 50 miles north, heard it like thunder rolling across the ground. In Dartmouth, the air pressure crushed doors and threw people into walls. In Halifax, whole neighborhoods vanished between one breath and the next. At the waterfront, firefighters from the Richmond station were gone. Their trucks, hoses, and men were lifted into the air and scattered across the docks. A streetcar filled with passengers simply disappeared, its iron frame found later melted and twisted a mile away. Those who survived remembered only a flash and the sensation of flying. The blast wave tore through the north end, flattening houses and factories in a single breath. The wooden buildings burned instantly. Clothes caught fire where people stood. Windows became blades of glass. A soldier later said it felt as if the air itself had turned solid. At the city hospital, patients were thrown from their beds. Nurses crawled through broken halls to reach them. In the railway yard, trains derailed, and men lay scattered across the snow. The telegraph wires fell silent, one after another. Even the church bells stopped ringing. A few miles away in Bedford Basin, sailors on other ships saw the explosion as a blinding sun. Then the wave hit them, first the shock, then the wind, then the rain of debris. Some ships caught fire, others were lifted from the water. One officer wrote later, "It was as if the sea had risen to swallow us." In Richmond, the part of Halifax closest to the blast, almost every building was gone. Whole families vanished, leaving only scorched foundations. Streets once lined with houses were now trenches of brick and ash. The Richmond School collapsed with its students inside. The sugar refinery burned to the ground. Railway cars overturned and burst into flame. A soldier stationed nearby described the silence after the blast. He said it was worse than the noise. The wind stopped. The smoke hung heavy over the harbor. And then came the sound of crying. For hours, the city was a storm of confusion. Those still able to move stumbled through ruins, searching for others. Some shouted names until their voices failed. Others stood in shock, staring at where their homes had been. The air smelled of ash, oil, and burned wood. It was hard to tell where the sea ended and the city began. In the minutes that followed, snow began to fall, thick and gray, mixed with dust and soot. It coated the wreckage, softening the edges of destruction. A man crawling from the debris of his house said the falling snow looked beautiful until he realized it was full of ash and glass. Near the docks, the wreck of the Mont Blanc still burned. The remains of the ship glowed red under the drifting smoke. Chunks of metal rained into the harbor, still hot enough to ignite the water's surface. The explosion had created a tidal wave nearly 50 feet high that swept across the harbor, flooding the lower streets and carrying bodies, wood, and animals out to sea. The train yard was destroyed, but one engine had survived. The train 10, whose engineer, Vince Coleman, had stayed behind to send a warning to an incoming passenger train. Moments before the blast, he tapped out his final message. "Hold up train, ammunition ship on fire, making for Pier 6. Goodbye." That warning stopped the train miles away and saved hundreds of lives. Coleman's body was found later near his telegraph key. By 10 o'clock, the city was unrecognizable. Fires burned everywhere. The air was thick with smoke. Men carried the wounded on doors and blankets. Churches became hospitals. Schools became morgues. And through it all, snow continued to fall. Slow, silent, unending. People wandered in shock. A woman walked barefoot through the snow, still clutching a child's hand, not realizing the child was gone. A sailor pulled himself from the harbor and began digging through ruins with bare hands. Everywhere there was the sound of calling, the sound of searching, the sound of disbelief. From the hills above the harbor, a photographer raised his camera hours later and took the first image of the ruined city. The picture showed smoke still rising, roofs gone, streets erased, and the black skeletons of factories and churches. It became one of history's most haunting images. Halifax, the city in ruins. By noon, rescue trains were being prepared. Telegraph lines buzzed with broken messages. City destroyed. Thousands dead. Send help. In Boston, the nearest major city, volunteers began to gather supplies, unaware that their kindness would soon define the story's second half. For now, Halifax lay silent beneath its own smoke. The sea was calm again, but the city was gone. When the roar faded, there was only silence. A city that had once hummed with life was now a wasteland of smoke, ash, and broken stone. Halifax, the proud port of Nova Scotia, lay in ruin. The blast had carved a scar into its heart. In the North End, entire streets were gone. Where homes once stood, there were only craters and twisted beams. A gray fog rolled through the wreckage, made of dust and burning wood. People crawled from the debris, dazed, faces covered in ash. They looked around as if waking from a nightmare they could not yet believe was real. Men called for their wives. Women screamed for their children. The sound was scattered, thin, as if the city itself was crying. The great explosion had killed more than 1,600 people in a single instant. Another 9,000 were injured. Thousands more were missing, trapped or buried beneath the ruins. But those numbers meant nothing to the survivors who stumbled through the gray streets. They knew only that everything was gone. The fires that followed were nearly as deadly as the blast itself. Wooden houses, torn apart by the shockwave, caught fire and burned in the cold wind. Whole blocks turned to flame. At the harbor, warehouses filled with coal and oil fed the inferno. A low, steady rumble echoed through the ruins as one building after another collapsed. By noon, snow began to fall again. Thick, heavy flakes, darkened by smoke. It mixed with soot, coating everything in gray. Survivors used blankets, boards, even door frames to carry the wounded. The streets were impassable, blocked by wreckage and fire. At the military hospital, the wounded arrived in endless waves. Doctors worked by candlelight, their hands raw and bleeding. Supplies ran out within hours. Bandages were torn from curtains, morphine from battlefield stores. There were too many to save. In one room, a nurse washed a child's face clean of ash, only to find the child could not see. Thousands had been blinded by shattered glass. Father MacDonald, a local priest, walked through the snow carrying a cross made of wood. He stopped at every street corner, whispering prayers over the dead. He said later that the city smelled like gunpowder and grief. People followed him, silent, looking for something to hold on to. In the harbor, ships burned on the water. Some had been thrown onto the shore by the tidal wave that followed the blast. Others drifted, half sunk, like ghosts of steel and smoke. Seagulls circled above, confused by the silence. From the hill above Richmond, the view was unbearable. A sea of wreckage stretched to the horizon. What had been houses were now only blackened outlines in the snow. A man stood there for hours, clutching a photograph he found in the rubble. No one knew whose it was, but he couldn't let go. Soldiers from nearby garrisons began searching the ruins. They dug with bare hands, pulled survivors from basements, carried bodies to makeshift morgues. Some houses still burned, others collapsed as rescuers entered them. Every sound, a crack of wood, a gust of wind, made people flinch. The fear of another explosion lingered like a shadow. The telegraph lines were down. The city was cut off from the outside world. For hours, no one beyond Halifax knew what had happened. Rumors spread across Nova Scotia: a German attack, a munitions raid, the end of the war. Only fragments of truth made it through. In the Richmond rail yard, what was left of Vince Coleman's train still smoldered. A few railway workers found his telegraph key under the rubble. They cleaned it, set it on a table, and placed a note beside it. He stayed. To many, that simple phrase said more than any monument could. As night fell, the temperature dropped below freezing. Fires burned through the ruins, casting orange light over the snow. People huddled in cellars, schools, and churches, waiting for help. Some sang hymns softly, their voices trembling. Others simply sat in silence, staring at what was left of their city. The stars came out over Halifax that night, but no one looked up. Smoke still rose from the harbor like a black veil across the sky. The wind carried the smell of salt, ash, and sorrow. It was said later that the silence of that night felt heavier than the explosion itself. And yet, within that silence, small acts of courage began to take shape. A doctor lit a single lamp and kept working. A sailor built a stretcher from broken planks. A child shared her only blanket with a stranger. The city had fallen, but its heart had not stopped beating. By the morning after the explosion, Halifax was a city wounded but alive. Smoke still hung over the harbor, rising from thousands of fires that refused to die. The air was bitter with the smell of ash and salt. But through that haze came movement. People began to act. In the frozen streets, neighbors became rescuers. Men and women who had lost everything turned to help others. They pulled survivors from cellars, carried the injured on doors and sleds, and searched for anyone who still breathed. There were no doctors nearby for many of them, only courage and instinct. They tore up clothing for bandages. They built fires to keep the wounded warm. Even those who could barely stand worked until they collapsed. At the military hospital, the halls overflowed. Beds were filled with men, women, and children covered in burns and glass. Nurses moved like ghosts through the smoke, whispering words of comfort. Some had not slept in 20 hours. They washed blood from their hands, took a deep breath, and went back for more. A doctor later said, "We stopped counting the wounded. We only counted those who could still be saved." In the face of destruction, humanity became the only medicine left. Help began to arrive from the nearby towns of Truro, Amherst, and New Glasgow. They brought doctors, blankets, food, and lumber. But the greatest aid came from across the border, from the city of Boston. When the telegraph lines finally came alive late that day, a message reached Massachusetts. Halifax, devastated, many thousands dead or injured, needs every help possible. Within hours, Boston responded. The governor ordered a relief train to be prepared immediately, loaded with doctors, nurses, food, and supplies. By midnight, the train was ready to leave, even though a blizzard was rolling in from the north. The journey was brutal. Snow and wind battered the tracks. At times, the train moved at walking speed through white walls of drifting ice, but no one turned back. Inside, doctors sharpened instruments and wrote notes on scraps of paper by lantern light. A nurse on board said later, "We knew the people of Halifax were waiting. That was enough." At dawn on December 8th, 2 days after the explosion, the Boston relief train arrived in Halifax. Its whistle echoed through the ruins like a promise. Crowds gathered despite the snow, tears freezing on their faces. They cheered for strangers they had never met. The train doors opened, and the doctors stepped out into the cold, carrying stretchers and medical kits. One of them whispered, "It looks like the end of the world." Another replied, "Then we will begin the work of making a new one." The Boston team set up field hospitals across the city. They treated burns, amputated limbs, and comforted the dying. They worked beside Canadian nurses and soldiers, hand in hand. The sound of saws and crying filled the rooms, but so did the murmur of prayers and gratitude. In the days that followed, thousands of lives were saved. Supplies from across Canada and New England poured in: blankets, coal, milk, and candles. Volunteers built soup kitchens and churches. Every corner of the city became a place of refuge. A school classroom turned into a ward for the blind. A church basement became a shelter for mothers and children. Amid the suffering, there were stories of extraordinary kindness. A baker gave away all his flour to feed the hungry. A soldier carried an injured boy 2 miles through snow and rubble to safety. An old woman shared her last loaf of bread with a stranger because, as she said, "He looked more lost than I did." Moments like these became the soul of Halifax's recovery. Reporters who arrived from across Canada expected to find despair. Instead, they found courage. They wrote of a city where strangers worked side by side, where kindness outweighed fear. They wrote of light in the ashes. By the end of that first week, the snowstorm that had slowed the relief trains now blanketed the ruins in white. It covered the wreckage, muffled the noise, and made the city strangely peaceful. The fires finally went out. The cold bit deep, but the people kept moving. They shoveled paths through the snow to reach hospitals and food stations. Children helped carry water. Every action, no matter how small, became an act of hope. One survivor later said, "We did not rebuild because we were strong. We rebuilt because someone reached out a hand and we took it." The people of Boston stayed for weeks. When they finally left, the people of Halifax lined the tracks to wave goodbye. They stood in the snow as the train pulled away, hats in hand, tears in their eyes. A bond had been formed in tragedy, one that would never be forgotten. Years later, Halifax would send Boston a Christmas tree every December as a symbol of gratitude and friendship. Each tree stood tall in the heart of Boston Common, covered in lights. And when the lights were lit, people said they could almost see the glow reach all the way back across the sea, to the city that had once been broken, and to the hearts that helped it heal. When the fires finally died and the smoke drifted out to sea, the people of Halifax were left with a city of silence. Nearly 2 square miles lay in ruins. But even as the ashes cooled, the work of rebuilding had already begun. Winter was hard and unforgiving. Snow covered the wreckage like a white shroud. Many families had no roofs, no walls, only the sky. But there was strength in their grief. They built tents, lean-tos, and rough shelters from splintered boards. Neighbors gathered around shared fires. They shared bread, tea, and stories of survival. No one was truly alone. In those early weeks, the most urgent task was simply to survive the cold. Relief shipments continued to arrive: coal from Cape Breton, lumber from New Brunswick, medical supplies from across Canada. Volunteers organized food lines and distributed soup and bread to anyone who asked. Church bells rang again, not for mourning this time, but to call people to gather and rebuild. The Canadian government sent engineers and architects to assess the damage. What they found was staggering. More than 6,000 buildings destroyed, 12,000 people homeless, entire neighborhoods erased. But instead of despair, they saw an opportunity to rebuild not just what had been lost, but something stronger, safer, and more modern. Plans were drawn up for a new district to rise from the ashes, the Hydrostone neighborhood. It would be built from fireproof concrete blocks, lined with wide streets and gardens. The design came from a Scottish architect named Thomas Adams, known for his work in garden cities. He wanted Halifax to be not just a repaired city, but a reborn one, a place that reflected both beauty and endurance. Construction began in the spring of 1918. Workers came from all over the Maritimes. They cleared rubble, straightened streets, and laid foundations for new homes. For the first time since the blast, hammers replaced the sound of crying. The rhythm of rebuilding became the heartbeat of the city. One journalist wrote, "The people of Halifax rebuild with bare hands and full hearts." It was true. Widows laid bricks, sailors mixed cement, children carried nails and tools, proud to be part of something bigger than themselves. Every act of work felt like defiance against despair. In the midst of all this, new leaders emerged. Mayors, engineers, and volunteers coordinated the enormous effort. The Halifax Relief Commission was established to manage the rebuilding and provide support for families who had lost homes or loved ones. They offered funds, housing, and jobs. More than that, they offered purpose. Life began to return in small but powerful ways. Shops reopened in wooden shacks. Schools held classes in tents. Churches conducted services under open skies. Music drifted again through the cold air. Violins, hymns, and a laughter of children who refused to be silent. As months turned to years, the city changed. The new hydrostone houses stood proudly along the hills, solid and warm. Each one represented more than shelter. It was proof that Halifax could rise again. Many who lived there later said the smell of fresh stone and mortar became a symbol of rebirth. The harbor, once filled with wreckage, was cleared and restored. Ships returned. Trade resumed. Factories reopened, hiring those who had lost everything. The sound of industry returned like an old friend. The memory of the explosion was never far, but it began to live alongside gratitude. Each December, the people of Halifax remembered the tragedy, not with anger, but with compassion. They honored the dead, thanked the living, and looked forward to what came next. Boston remained forever tied to that story. In 1919, the people of Halifax sent a giant Christmas tree to Boston as a gesture of thanks for the relief and kindness that had come during their darkest hour. The tree stood tall in Boston Common, shining with lights. When the crowd gathered for the lighting ceremony, a Boston mayor spoke softly, saying, "From sorrow we have grown friendship." That tradition continues every year, a bridge of light across time and sea. By the early 1920s, Halifax had regained its strength. The scars were still visible, but so were the signs of life. The city had become a symbol of endurance. Children born after the explosion grew up playing among new parks and streets, unaware that the ground beneath them had once been fire and ruin. An old sailor who survived the blast wrote in his diary, "The sea gives and the sea takes. It took from us that day, but it also brought us together." That line would later be engraved at a memorial overlooking the harbor. The story of Halifax's rebuilding was not just about stone and timber. It was about people who refused to let tragedy define them. They rebuilt their homes, their families, and their faith in one another, and through that, they rebuilt the meaning of hope itself. By 1922, the city stood proud once more. Trains whistled, ships came and went, life had returned, carrying with it the quiet strength that only loss can teach. The harbor reflected the sun again, calm and endless, as if nothing had ever happened. But deep within the hearts of those who remembered, the promise remained. Halifax would endure, no matter the storm.
Years passed. The ruins of Halifax gave way to new streets, new homes, and new lives. Children grew up playing where the earth had once burned. Ships came and went from the harbor as they always had. The scars of that terrible morning faded beneath brick and stone, but memory never truly disappeared. It lived quietly, like an echo beneath the waves. Every December, when the air grew cold and the sea misted in the dawn, people remembered. Families gathered at the memorial on Fort Needham Hill, where the bell tower stands above the city. They read the names of those lost, men, women, children, and let the wind carry their voices toward the harbor. Some cried, some stood in silence, others simply watched the snow fall over the water, the same harbor that had once destroyed and saved them. At 9:04 a.m., the exact minute of the explosion, the city paused. Church bells rang across Halifax. For a moment, every sound stopped except the slow toll of metal on air. It was not a sound of mourning, but of remembrance, steady, patient, alive. Down by the docks, where the Mont Blanc had once burned, fishermen still cast their nets. They spoke softly about their fathers and grandfathers who had been there that day. Some said they still found fragments of glass and twisted steel in the sand after storms, little pieces of the past carried by the tide. The story of the Halifax Explosion became part of the city's soul. It was taught in schools, sung in songs, whispered in bedtime stories. It was not just a tale of destruction, it was a story of people who stood together when everything fell apart. Teachers told their students that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The children listened, wide-eyed, as if hearing something sacred. In Boston, the Christmas tree from Halifax continued to shine each winter. Thousands gathered to see its lights flicker against the night sky. To most, it was a beautiful holiday tradition. To those who knew the story, it was something deeper, a promise kept across 100 years, a reminder that kindness given in one moment can echo for generations.
In 1967, on the 50th anniversary of the explosion, survivors gathered again. They were old now, gray-haired and slow, but their memories were sharp. One woman said she could still hear the glass breaking. Another said she still dreamed of snow falling on fire. They stood together, holding hands, their eyes on the harbor that had changed their lives forever. A young boy asked one of them, "Were you afraid?" She smiled and said, "Yes, but I was also loved." Those words became the truest description of Halifax, the city that had suffered but had never stopped loving. Through the years, artists painted the harbor, writers told the story, and filmmakers tried to capture its light and shadow. Yet none of them could fully describe what it meant to the people who lived it. Because the story was not only about an explosion, it was about the human spirit that rose after it. It was about the doctor who worked until his hands bled, the nurse who sang to the dying, the child who offered a blanket to a stranger. It was about resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet power of community. Today, the harbor is peaceful. Cargo ships move slowly across the water, their horns echoing through the fog. The Hydrostone neighborhood stands firm on the rebuilt ground, its streets lined with trees. Children ride bicycles where once there was rubble. Life has reclaimed what tragedy tried to take. But on certain mornings, when the light is pale and the air still, some say you can almost hear it, the faint hum of memory beneath the calm, the whisper of wind that sounds like distant thunder, the echo of a city that fell and rose again. The sea remembers, and so do its people. Each year, at the ceremony on Fort Needham Hill, the mayor of Halifax speaks the same simple words. We remember not the fire, but the light that followed. And as the crowd bows their heads, a single bell rings over the harbor. It carries across the city, over the rebuilt homes and quiet streets, through the snow and out to sea. In that sound lives everything Halifax became: grief, courage, kindness, endurance. It is the sound of memory that refuses to fade. For those who listen, it is more than history. It is a heartbeat. It is a promise that even in ruin there can be grace, that even after darkness there can be light, and that from the ashes of one December morning a city was born again.